Cool. Hey, Fleur, good morning.
Good morning.
So thanks so much for taking the time. We're having a bit of a chat around the Slack community that's been created. Just for those tuning in, my name is Chad Renando, and we created this community on Slack for leaders in the Australian innovation community. This came about initially as a result of a bit of response to COVID-19, but it seemed to hit a bit of a need. We've been going for about 3 weeks or so. We've had a couple of these chats before with people talking about the community itself, talking about the data behind it. But one of the things I noticed is very rapidly there's people that show up in the community and they start contributing and they start having a bit of a voice within the community around a certain area. And Fleur, you're one of them who's come in and from both a content, and you and I have had conversations as well as a result of the community taking it offline around advocacy. And it's something I've been watching for a while. And also within the community, you see people that you've kind of noticed on the sidelines. They've been involved in supporting entrepreneurs and innovation in Australia over the years, and your name kept popping up. So I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of get to know you through the Slack channel, but then also to then result in a conversation like this where we can chat about, so what does content and advocacy mean? So thank you very much on the Saturday morning for having a bit of a yarn. But I'd love to hear your take on, like, what have you thought as far as the growth of the Slack community itself, and where you see it going and the need maybe it fills.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, one of my bugbears is that we're in this fiercely competitive ecosystem that is also supposedly got a pay it forward mentality, and everyone's sort of, supposed to be collaborating, and yet that waxes and wanes. And so I think the COVID opportunity and also climate change present us with kind of a war room situation where I'm hoping it's going to start generating truer collaboration between the states, between different parts of the ecosystem. Let's be frank, we're all going to be very resource poor in the next few years. Unless we start truly collaborating, it's really not going to work very well or very effectively for anyone. So when we're light on resources, I think the best thing we can do is not cross over and stumble into each other and duplicate work. So like you, where I see, really good content or research popping up, I think fantastic. Let's put the spotlight on that so someone else doesn't have to go and replicate that. Let's not ask founders to complete 5 surveys when they can complete 1 and make it, the big survey. They're all time and energy poor. So, and let's not confuse people. I think people get fatigue around advocacy. So if they're being asked to contribute ideas or information about a particular topic, and they get asked continuously by different organizations, there's a fatigue there, and they, sometimes just give up, and then we lose the opportunity to actually get that grassroots input. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
oh, that's great. And like surveys in particular, like that's been huge. Like obviously everybody wants to know, and Jeremy from Artesian's been doing some really good stuff on his cohort. And we've seen some bespoke, some distinct surveys coming out. But you're right. It's like everyone wants to say, we need the answers, and the challenge is it's all done with good intent, right? But like with any of this stuff, we have to assume good intent. Everyone just wants to help and get the answers. But you're right, it does create a bit of almost a fragmentation of all these different voices, and the core that we're trying to foster. The entrepreneurs are like, man, I'm just trying to keep my doors open. I'm trying to figure out what's my new business model. Like I've just been completely transformed overnight, and I want to help, but I got to stay alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think pre-COVID, the focus really was starting to shift and needed to shift to global is, where we should be looking. And we should join forces to try and make that easier. So rather than states competing with each other and pockets of the ecosystem competing with each other, let's make everything bigger and better so that we can really get a slice of that global pie.
That's right. Good growth, as the idiom goes, grow the pie, not compete for the scarce slices that are there. That abundance thinking, and scarcity thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm also a bit encouraged, because I see this as just a natural life cycle of where we're supposed to be at. In that, like in 2015, the ecosystem as we know it today, acknowledging there's heaps of programs and a lot of support for small business and entrepreneurs that were happening before. And there's a few legacy programs like iLab up in Queensland, and a few others were around like 2000 or 1999, they started emerging. But from 2015 and the ideas boom, and then states following suit, and then we saw this explosion of innovation hubs and accelerator programs. Techstars started coming into the scene. We saw some big ones and then some smaller ones emerge to fill the gaps. We saw some specialization now, and also some very distinct relationships with global precincts. So you have Queensland's CEA with QUT going directly into creative industries over in Thailand. You've got down in Melbourne specifically with medtech into Asia. You have Bridge Hub with agriculture into Israel. As we're seeing these really distinct, and that's very encouraging. But how do we collectively do that? Not everybody have an agriculture into Israel, but we say, well, let's let them do that really, really well, and let's find a niche and gap. Are you seeing similar kind of things?
I'm definitely seeing, different verticals emerge, and I'm really encouraged by that. And I think, let's applaud the fintech model for a moment, because I know it was built on the strength of the banks in Australia, but it's a really excellent model in terms of showing us the strengths that can be there with some of those brands going global, despite there being different regulations, globally. So that's a great start for us, and I think it gives us something we can look at. And I'm definitely seeing ag tech, as a strength. And I think from an international point of view, you have conversations with people like Startup Genome and people who are part of that community. And Australia is considered a natural probably in that space, and also in the environmental space. And I think we just have not leveraged that opportunity. I call it envirotech because I want to encompass more than clean tech, which has become a bit dirty in terms of what it actually includes, and go well beyond the obvious things. Like there's things happening in the oceans, there's things happening in species that, intersect with what's happening in energy. So we haven't tapped that, and we're naturally seen as a brand for that in Australia. So I think leaning into some of those kind of natural areas and areas of strength is really important. How do we do that? Well, I think what you've done with the Slack channel is a great start. Startup Oz's work is an excellent start. Creating a place where you can deposit the key information, statistics, and who the players are, so that we can look at that mud map, is instantly valuable. I mean, it tells people who are thinking of entering the game, where is the game?
Yeah.
Am I replicating something that's already there, or am I filling a gap? How well are those businesses doing? Who's invested in them? All of that in one place. That's a huge, step up in terms of, really owning that area. And I think eventually, when you have the strength in numbers, you evolve into a FinTech Australia. So my hope would be, I'm obsessed with the environment, but let's talk about envirotech. My hope would be you'd have an envirotech Australia eventually, because why wouldn't you have a body that advocates specifically in that space, that builds that brand specifically internationally, that creates collaboration opportunities, a sense of a mature ecosystem. It increases the sense of value and self-worth of people who are part of that group, rather than feeling like they're on the fringe. So when it matures, I think eventually a body that specifically looks after that vertical is a good idea.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, there was an interesting conversation in the Slack this week around just that, where on the one hand, we have all these different things popping up, right? And everyone wanting to do a different type of accelerator or a different type of program. And I think that's actually healthy. Like when I was running an innovation hub in Ipswich, there's another innovation hub popped up. I'm like, hey, what are you doing? But that's actually good, because no single program or no single space can be all things to all people. I think competition, as we know, it can be healthy. But the flip side of that is when it comes to advocacy, and when it comes to a voice, particularly for a representative to government and lobbying, that's where the diversity doesn't necessarily help us, because then government's like, mate, we got to make a decision in like 12 hours, and I got these 5 submissions. What do I do? And so that's where it does help for everybody to say, look, I may not be 100% aligned, but let's get behind something so we can have a common voice, and let's see if we can adapt to suit all of our needs. Now that's not an easy narrative.
No, and look, I'm going to be really frank about that. It's a skill set. So let's be, let's be real about that. It's a skill set that entrepreneurs don't necessarily naturally have. So you don't want to be the bull in the china shop on that conversation. So I think, when you get to the point where advocacy is required, not just on an issue, but on behalf of, a vertical sector or whatever the case might be, pay it its due worth and actually, give that job to someone who has that skill set. Because otherwise you may find yourself going backwards, rather than forwards, in my opinion. And I think Startup Oz has done it particularly well, and they have that skill set, but it's been really challenging for them because that has to be funded. They're not a membership body. How do you fund that work? TechSydney has an element of advocacy, but more about collaborating with the rest of the ecosystem, because Sydney itself, other than, innovation precincts and that sort of thing, it doesn't require, we don't take a national, stance when you have a body like Startup Oz. So it's about picking those specific areas of advocacy that are going to add value and not just compete with, the conversation that's already being had.
Yeah, and I think it's a natural evolution. I think we are going to be seeing that with, we have Startup Oz. Alex is just amazing. We have TechSydney. We have what LaunchVic is doing, and Startup Victoria down in Victoria. We have these pockets that are happening. You've got, from government representation with the Office of the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur, albeit within government. So we are seeing some mixed hybrids, and what Meshpoint does for regional WA and Startup WA over in Western Australia, but then under a national body. And then, as you're saying before, these specific verticals. Now, even as I say all of that, you can see like, wow, that's a lot, but I think it's happening. What I'd like to do is hop over to the Slack real quick. I'm just going to share a screen, and just for those who haven't been familiar, just kind of talk through some of the rooms that have been created, which may help kind of the conversation we're having. All right, so this is the Slack channel we were talking about before, and this really was an experiment. When you see, my experience with Slack in the past has been there's maybe like 3 to 4 channels, and quite often they can have a lot of content within those channels. It's kind of hard to sift through, but they are really good in that, just having really rapid fire and transient conversations. Now, I've been doing some research as well. I've got a PhD, a thesis I'm working on, and part of that has been really deeply understanding what are the roles and functions within an ecosystem, within the support for entrepreneurs. And so when this whole thing came up, and Di Somerville actually created the Slack initially, Di from the Regional Pitch Fest and Bridge Hub down in New South Wales. I started going in and started creating these different channels. And also what's unique about this is that when everybody joins, they are a member of all the channels, which can be really overwhelming at first. But once you get used to it, people are starting to find their home. Some people hang out in government. Some people hang out in, say, Indigenous or in social enterprise or in a particular sector such as mining or agriculture or property, or certain functions like university and research or tourism and hospitality. So we're seeing just it evolve. But I guess maybe I'd just touch base with you, Fleur, on how do you feel that's working as far as having all these different rooms in there?
Yeah, well, look, it's a much bigger version of something that I've been doing with Startup Oz in particular. So, we had a really good organizing system. Like I read I don't even know what percentage of my day I spend reading content. So for me, having a place to organize that content keeps me sane. And if there's, another benefit besides just my organization to sharing that content, then I feel, really healthy. So there was a micro version of this that we worked with Startup Oz on, just to kind of capture things like, for example, who's been funded, and at what level. And it gives you a place you can go back to scrape that data into something else. So I'm used to using that system, and it works really well because it's very quick. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll dump something in there and then go back and kind of deeply read that, that channel. So I think it's a great system. I love Slack. Entrepreneurs and the ecosystem are heavy users of Slack. So, big wins on that in that respect. It's reasonably searchable. Yes, you gravitate towards, I'm probably using about 5 of your channels most consistently. And that probably reflects where I think the urgency is at the moment, and also a couple of my passion spots, like the environment, for example. So I think in order to use the hive mind to stay in touch with exactly what's being said, the latest, information in that area, it's great. And you're relying on the quality of your network to curate well, so it doesn't become spammy. It's not stuff that was, shared 2 days ago and so it's old. You want it to be, high quality, relevant, recent, perhaps with a comment so that people don't have to click through to the link without knowing a little bit about that information. And then, of course, the commentary itself adds incredibly valuable information, to that sense making, that goes on. And then I would imagine that's really useful for scraping into a report at some point. But to me, like, I was involved with the creation of TechSydney, and the TED model was a curated model. So, TED's a brilliant model, it still is, but what it did was basically brought experts together in their field, curated their content, and then banked on the fact that people sitting in the audience or consuming that content would add value to that expertise, and you'd have that kind of hive mind effect. So it's a proven system for extracting expertise and sharing knowledge. In my opinion, I think it's great, and people can kind of graze on it or go deeper as they choose to.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for that. That's one of the things we are seeing, is that people are using it as it suits them. Like, you have a cohort that are in there and they're just every day, and as things are happening, they're in constant conversation. Other ones maybe do their morning check-in or their afternoon peruse and maybe comment on a few things. And others maybe like once or twice a week they'll come in and just check up on all the channels, because if something comes in that you haven't actually looked at, it turns it white. And if somebody comments on you or does an @channel, which we've limited to just admins, it notifies you, like the red one you can see over there. And we are seeing, as you say, some of the more dominant channels, particularly in this time. So you have like entrepreneurs and startups, where you see people just posting some things that are relevant and then starting having a bit of a conversation around those, or even just giving an uptick to have a bit of a narrative. Who's getting funding, and look, this isn't in depth. There's other things like, say, Crunchbase or TechSydney or Melbourne Laneways or a tech board, for instance, which are keeping a bit of track from an analytics perspective. But what we're trying to do is just crowdsource a bit of that data to funnel into others that are doing it. Again, we're not trying to be all things to all people, but we are looking at just providing a bit of a resource for people to have a conversation around. And then really what we're after is, so what does it mean for you, and how do you get value out of it, and maybe connecting a network with other people that find like value and take it offline and go do your thing. Really, that's the hope of just being a bit of that node, that nexus.
Absolutely. I mean, even in the event space, the interesting thing about events is, if I put my TechSydney hat on, we're looking at stuff that's happening in Sydney and filtering out everything else usually. But now I'm wide open to anything, global, interstate, because it's all virtual. And so suddenly I find that, everyone's got access to this incredible smorgasbord of, great content that's happening all around the world, because everyone's serving it up virtually.
That's right. That's right. And there's even a project that's come up to then aggregate them all. And a few of us have worked on projects like the aggregated approach. But again, always encouraging other people who want to give it a go. It is a significant challenge. And if somebody can crack that, to be able to find a single place for all entrepreneur related events within Australia. I've played around with APIs into Meetup and Eventbrite, but we've got some pretty good initiatives happening there as well. Another one that we introduced, I'm interested in your views on, is this daily poll. So we've put in here just a daily snapshot to ask about things that are pertinent for maybe a news story of the day, a question we want to hear from leaders. There's about just over 600 people that are a part of this, and we get maybe there's about 130, 140 that actively contribute every day, and out of those maybe 20 to 40% then engage in the polls, and so they're fairly indicative numbers. And we're asking things, obviously COVID's top of mind at the moment. How much time are you expecting to spend now or in the future is one we asked this week. Do you get value out of these daily polls? A bit of a sense check on how we're doing, but also to provide insights for others looking to do similar things, because we want people to be able to take what we're doing, learn from it, do it better, apply it to your own community. So it's a bit of a test. Fleur, what are your thoughts on the daily polls and kind of the feedback that we're getting?
Yeah, I mean, I love polls. I think as long as people are participating at the percentage level you're talking about, then it's definitely worth doing. I think it's really good for people's mental health at this time, as long as everyone's being honest. And I think with a degree of anonymity, people will be more encouraged to be candid. We are in an ecosystem that can have a bit of bravado attached to it, and I think now is not the time for that. People need to get super real, and it's a marathon, not a sprint, what we're about to experience. And so every week's people are going to feel differently. They'll be making decisions differently. And so if people are sharing that information really honestly, I think, it's a great sanity check for people that don't feel so alone in how they're feeling, and they may be better informed, in taking that decision. I mean, an example would be there's a lot of, co-working spaces, as you said, accelerator programs. Nobody probably wants to be taking decisions outside of the pack right now, because they'll be judged accordingly by the startups and the entrepreneurs. So, having a sense amongst the community of, what a fair and reasonable package looks like, within those spaces, is really helpful for people who are planning those decisions. So, what are your peers doing? You don't necessarily have to identify yourself when you're providing that information, but it gives you a bit of a benchmark.
Yeah, absolutely. And even things like, you mentioned some of the bravado. That's one of the reasons why we asked this question, because I've been working from home, finishing up my thesis for a few months now, and I know some of the realities of the intention behind getting physically fit while you're working from home, and the reality of kind of the exercise and the cardio you get coming from my chair to my refrigerator and back again 10 times a day. or doing my crunches as I bend over to get ice for a drink. So there's certain real human aspects to what we're going to experience. And it was great to see some people respond even here and say, look, I think it's going to significantly decline. And if one person says it, then all of a sudden everybody else doesn't feel so bad and think, oh, okay, well, maybe that then opens up a conversation to say, do we create an accountability cluster? How can we then have that conversation in a safe place? So, and I just want to give a shout out as well, because again, I've been watching the work that you've been doing on TechSydney, as far as a platform, and how's that been? And are you finding a more demand for things like this? With the project with Normalise and Joe over there?
Yeah. So look, credit to Joe Allen, Normalise, other contributors, Paul Towers, who up until recently was, contributing to our comms and newsletters and that sort of thing. So TechSydney is now volunteer run. And so this platform was created by, in response to a City of Sydney grant, created in collaboration with Joe Allen and Normalise, who has a system for this whole area, and he's done a lot of work in the ecosystem on similar kind of hubs. How I contributed to that conversation was trying to get it quite visually appealing, and it's not perfect on that level, but having the speed of being able to post a link and have a graphic window come up, I think, is important. Just dumping data into something that looks like data, as we know through our phone experience, doesn't necessarily draw people in. So I think the speed in which you can do that, and just recognizing that, we started out at TechSydney creating a lot of the content ourselves, and as you know, it's really exhausting and very resource hungry to do that. In fact, the ecosystem is full of so many good content creators. So we took a curation model and just sort of thought, look, we'll highlight the most relevant content for our community. Most of it exists. We commissioned some of it. We invited people to write opinion pieces. I feel that when there's more highlighting of things like opinion pieces from the ecosystem, more people write, those pieces, because it is a competitive environment, and in a good way. And when people start to see the same voices featured in opinion pieces, they think, oh, I'm going to have a go. And suddenly you see there's more being written from across the community. And what we also didn't want to do was compete with the startup titles and publications, because, as everyone would appreciate, it's really tough for them to survive. And they're doing a great service to our community by actually existing in a focused way, focusing in on entrepreneurship and startups. And I know that, having created a TV show in the space, I spent 2 years as a side hustle producing the Entrepreneurs TV program, which was first on Sky Business and then on the Your Money platform. And, you know, there's a lot of love and hard work that goes into that. You don't always get remunerated at all or well to do that sort of thing. So we didn't want to undercut what they're doing. So we actually send traffic their way. And that's the intention of that platform. We also had a crack at centralising the events that were relevant, and the filter we used for that was founder relevant. So a lot of what we do at TechSydney is sort of really focused on founder first, and then the teams, you know, come along as sort of a secondary thing. Look, community building is really hard, and in Sydney it's harder than usual because there's a lot of activity and people are very, you know, busy and transactional. So they're sort of based on, they've got their head down over what they're doing. And unless it's really, really important or high quality, they're not going to pay that much attention. So I think, you know, we've had a bit of experimentation. We think some parts of the recipe are working well, but we're also reviewing at the moment who else in the ecosystem is doing the same thing, and, you know, what's necessary. Like, we've had conversations with Spark Festival, for example, Maxine. You know, they do event curation really well. They've got a really strong event information brand, a great database. You know, we're in collaboration with them on some levels. That makes sense. Again, going back to the original conversation, not wasting the resource.
Yeah. The and how do we use those platforms, as you said, to also build community? I think people are looking for that voice, the opinion pieces, but the where it's kind of validated positions, meaning, like, we're very intentional as far as the Slack community we have here of focusing on leaders, and we don't want to be, you know, elitist. But I've had a few entrepreneurs come in here and say, look, man, I'm just after funding, or I just need to figure out how to transition my business. And there's groups out there specifically for that. That's the lifeblood of the hubs. Just like you were saying, like the startup dailies and the innovation Oz, like, they are content providers. And so we need to be able to support them. But there also needs to be almost like this area where we're going to have a leadership conversation around what really needs to happen. So we are looking at yeah.
I think focusing, you know, is really important. You have to, it's the same as building a startup. You have to stand for something and be going after a particular target. One thing I think that has started to shift, it was a point of frustration amongst startups a few years ago when I started working on the TV show, is that the media tends to hero and favour funding announcements. If you're not funded by venture capital, you're not even on the radar. I mean, you look at a company like Envato, and they bootstrapped to 50 million, you know, and they were, if you went back over the records, they probably weren't really on the radar until they got to a certain point of success. So that's a frustration for a lot of startups, because they feel action unless it's related to funding, and that creates a kind of a weird skew in the conversation. So that, of course, it has changed and will change, because funding not going to be around to the same degree. So the bootstrapping model is going to be accented, and that will create a different dynamic with the content pieces. And what a few of us are trying to do at the moment is, you know, hero the examples of companies that are, you know, pivoting or trying something different, or just surviving and, you know, getting some traction in this market, because we need some hope, some optimism. We need examples, you know, of how entrepreneurs are tackling this issue, not sugarcoating it, but just making sure that that content gets some oxygen, because it's really important right now, I think. And I've noticed that the startup press are doing the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And as you say, like if all we ever hear is the funding, it actually creates a black box on what the heck just happened from, you know, starting my business when we get a lot of hype around the pitch events, and that's great. And then, you know, it's like a movie where 90 minutes later, a bunch of stuff happens in the middle. And by the way, we have a happy ending and they get funded and they're on their way. But the other thing is we also don't even hear about it after the fact. I mean, unless it fails catastrophically, you know, like some major issue happens. Sometimes they just kind of quietly go under. Other times, you know, maybe they go on and be a big success. But it's like we're only getting these like 2 or 3 points. And I think the work that you do, the work I know that's been happening at TechSydney and Startup Daily, Innovation Oz, a lot of the other content providers, as well as Alex with Startup Oz, a lot of the rich advocacy that's happening there, and some of the advocacy groups that are now forming, really are doing a good job on highlighting different stages. It's a lot of work. A lot of it, as you say, is volunteer run. This whole, you know, Slack channels is definitely volunteer run, but we do it because it just, you fill the need and you provide value. And if the market sees that value, then it can sustain, and people come around and support it. So we are seeing a bit of that, but you're definitely a part of it. And I really appreciate you taking the time out on this Saturday morning for an Easter weekend to have a bit of a yarn. I do really appreciate your work, and it's been fantastic even within this situation with COVID to finally be able to connect with people that we've kind of admired from afar. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, look, back at you, because I've been, you know, consuming your content, particularly that ecosystem maps and that sort of thing, and it's fantastic, and you're an absolute machine. I can't believe there's only like a week in between different ecosystem maps sometimes. I'm not sure how you do it, but whatever formula you're applying, keep at it, because it's awesome stuff, really valuable.
Right. Thanks heaps, Fleur. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and take care and keep doing what you're doing. See ya.
Thanks, Chad. See you. Ciao.